I still remember the sound of the door closing. Not slamming, not softly. Just closing. Like I was something she could quietly leave behind. I was 16 years old when my mother told me to pack a bag. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just said, "You're old enough to figure it out." Figure what out? How to survive. How to pay rent. How to finish school without a parent. I stood in the hallway of the only home had ever known. Holding a backpack with 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, and the last birthday card my uncle had ever given me. "Mom, where am I supposed to go?" I asked. She didn't look at me. "You've always been dramatic. You'll manage." And that was it. No hug, no explanation, no goodbye. The door closed. And with it, something inside me broke. I remember watching families pass by. Mothers holding hands with their children. Fathers carrying sleepy toddlers on their shoulders. And I asked myself the same question over and over again. Why wasn't I enough? Had I done something so terrible? I worked part-time, I got good grades, I never caused trouble. But none of it mattered. Because when my mom decided I was no longer useful, she erased me. My mom's older brother. He was quiet, serious, always reading. But whenever he visited, he would ask about school. He would slip me a little money. He once told me, "You're stronger than you think." I didn't understand then. I do now. Because after that night, I had no choice but to become strong. I worked double shifts at a small cafe. I finished high school while sleeping in shared rooms and cheap rentals. I ate instant noodles for months. And every time I wanted to quit, every time I felt that heavy anger rise in my chest, I remembered her face when she closed that door. Cold, detached, certain, she believed I would fail. And something inside me refused to give her that satisfaction. I built my life from nothing. Community college, night classes, internships. I learned about finance, investments, property. Not because I loved numbers, but because I never wanted to feel powerless again. By 28, I owned 2 small rental apartments. By 30, I had a stable business managing short-term properties. But it was mine. Built without her. Built without anyone. And I hadn't spoken to my mother in 14 years. Not a call. Not a message. Not even on holidays. Until the day my uncle passed away. A formal voice on the other end. "This is regarding the estate of Mr. Hassan. The family will gather next Friday for the inheritance reading." My chest tightened. My uncle. The only person who had ever looked at me like I mattered. He was gone. I didn't even know he had been sick. And then the voice said something that made my hands go cold. "You are listed as a primary beneficiary." Primary beneficiary. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in years. But I could already imagine her expression. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if fate was about to close a different door. I hadn't stepped into that house in 14 years. The same living room. The same long curtains. The same smell of polished wood and old memories. But I wasn't 16 anymore. I walked in wearing a tailored black suit. Calm, quiet. Unshaken. My mother was sitting on the sofa. She looked older, sharper around the edges. But her eyes. Still calculating. She froze when she saw me. "You." She said just that.
"No, how have you been?"
"No, I'm sorry." Just shock. My cousins were there too, whispering. Looking at me like I was some stranger who showed up uninvited. I took a seat across from them. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the file. As per Mr. Hassan's final will. The room went silent. My mother sighed straighter. I knew that look. Expectation. Greed wrapped in patience. My entire business portfolio, including properties and liquid assets, will be divided as follows. I wasn't prepared for what came next. 70% to my nephew. What? That's impossible. There must be a mistake. My mother's face drained of color. 70, she whispered. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. The remaining 30% will be distributed equally among the rest of the immediate family. 70%. I didn't know the exact number. But I knew my uncle was wealthy, very wealthy. My mother stared at me like I had stolen something from her. "You manipulated him," she said quietly. I met her eyes. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. "I haven't spoken to him in years," I replied calmly. The lawyer continued reading. There was one more condition. A final letter from Mr. Hassan is to be read privately to his nephew. That was me. My mother's jaw tightened. She hated not being in control. Hated not knowing. And as the meeting ended, something shifted in the room. The way they looked at me. Not with pity anymore, but with calculation, like predators adjusting to new power. Wet. Her voice had changed. Softer. Careful. I almost laughed. 14 years of silence. And now she wanted to talk. I'm busy, I said. Her expression flickered. You owe this family. I turned slowly. I repeated. You wouldn't even have known him without us, she snapped. That money belongs to the family. We have plans, investments. Ah. There it was. Not regret, not guilt. Money. I studied her face. The same woman who told me to figure life out at 16, now demanding millions. You left me with nothing, I said quietly. And I figured it out. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't about the past. No, I said. It's exactly about the past. And then she said something that almost made me admire her boldness. We expect you contribute at least half. Half. Half of what she had abandoned. I smiled. But it wasn't warm. We'll see, I replied. And I drove away. I didn't open the letter immediately. I took it home, placed it on my desk, stared at it for hours. Finally, I broke the seal. The paper smelled faintly of the same cologne my uncle used to wear. His handwriting was steady, clear. By the time you read this, I will no longer be here. My throat tightened. I know your mother believes family is about control. I believe family is about responsibility. I paused. I watched what happened when you were 16. I disagreed. Strongly. But you asked me not to interfere. That was true. I had begged him not to fight with her. I didn't want to make things worse. I knew then that you would either break or build. A small, sad smile formed on my face. And you built. He wrote about watching from a distance, about secretly paying for part of my college through anonymous transfers. About being proud. Proud. No one had ever used that word for me. Then came the final paragraph. This inheritance is not a reward. It is protection. Your mother and cousins carry debts and risky investments. If this money goes to them, it will vanish within years. I trust you to protect what I built. I leaned back in my chair. So this wasn't random. He knew. He understood. And one last thing. The letter ended. You owe no one for surviving. Those words hit harder than any number attached to the will. I owe no one messages. Calls. Polite at first, then urgent, then aggressive. We need to sit down, let's be reasonable. Family doesn't act like this. Family. Funny how that word only appeared when money did. By the third day they changed strategy. Emotional pressure. Your mother is struggling. She could lose the house. Do you want that on your conscience? Conscience? Where was hers when I slept on a bench? Where was the family when I worked 14-hour shifts to afford textbooks? And that's when I realized something. This wasn't just about money for them. It was about control. They expected the abandoned child to still feel guilty. To still feel small. To still obey. But I wasn't 16 anymore. And they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. When I drove away from that house, I could still see my mother standing in the driveway through the rearview mirror. She wasn't crying. She wasn't emotional. She was thinking. Planning. Calculating. I knew that look. She wasn't asking for help because she loved me. She was trying to figure out how to take control again. By the next week, the pressure started. At first, it came in the form of polite invitations. Let's have dinner. We should talk properly. Families shouldn't fight over money. But every message felt rehearsed, strategic. As if they had gathered in a room and discussed the best way to approach me. Then the tone shifted. My cousin Rashid called late one night. His voice wasn't friendly. You know Mom is panicking, right? He said. I stayed silent. The house is under loan. Uncle used his name to secure part of it. If you don't release some funds, things could get messy. Messy. That word lingered in my mind. I asked calmly, how much debt are we talking about? There was a pause. Then he gave me a number. It was large. Very large. Too large for someone who claimed everything was under control. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't temporary trouble. This was years of poor decisions stacked on top of pride. and they expected me to erase it. The abandoned 16-year-old was now their emergency solution. I spent the next few days going through the legal documents carefully. I hired my own advisor. Quietly. Privately. I wasn't gonna make emotional decisions. Not anymore. What my advisor discovered shocked even him. The debts weren't just loans. There were risky investments, failed partnerships, personal guarantees signed under pressure. My mother and cousins had been living far beyond their reality for years, assuming my uncle would always cover the losses. But he hadn't, he had stepped back. And now, he was gone. Which meant the safety net disappeared. And suddenly, I was the only one standing between them and collapse. My mother finally requested a formal meeting. This time, not at the house. At a restaurant, neutral ground. When I walked in, she was already there. For a brief second, I saw something unfamiliar in her eyes. Not anger. Not superiority. Fear. She folded her hands on the table. "We don't need to fight," she began softly. "You've done well for yourself. We're proud." Proud. That word again. But this time it felt hollow. "You weren't there," I replied calmly. "So I'm curious what exactly you're proud of." Her jaw tightened. But she continued, "We made mistakes. But that money, it belongs to the family. You can't just sit on it while we drown." I leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember the night you told me to figure life out?" I asked. She looked away. "That was different." "No," I said quietly. "It was the same. You believed I would survive without help. So now I believe you can too." Her expression changed instantly. The softness disappeared. "You're being selfish." There it was. The word people use when they can't control you anymore. I calmly placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of their debt structures. Risk assessments. Documents they probably hoped I would never read. "You didn't just make mistakes," I said. "You gambled. You assumed someone else would clean it up." She stared at the papers, stunned. "You investigated us." I protected myself. I corrected. Silence filled the space between us. Then she tried one last move. "If you don't help, we could lose everything." And that's when I said something that changed the direction of everything. "I'm willing to help. But not the way you expect." Her eyes lifted slowly. I explained my terms: no direct cash transfers, no blank checks, no emotional manipulation. I would create a structured financial recovery plan. Controlled payouts. Assets placed under trust management. Oversight handled legally. Transparency required. In simple words, I would help them rebuild. But they would never control a single dollar. My cousin exploded when he heard. "You don't trust us?" I looked at him steadily. No. That answer hung in the air like a truth no one wanted to face. But I wasn't finished. "If you refuse the structure," I added calmly, "then I refuse everything." They thought I needed them to say yes. They didn't realize I had already accepted walking away. The real shock came when the lawyer called a week later. Apparently, my uncle had anticipated resistance. There was an additional clause. If any beneficiary attempted legal action or harassment over distribution, their share would be frozen for 5 years or external supervision. 5 years. When that news reached the family, the calls stopped. The pressure softened. For the first time in 14 years, I felt power shift completely. Not because I had more money, but because I no longer carried guilt. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and reread my uncle's letter. "You owe no one for surviving." Those words felt different now. He hadn't just left me wealth. He had left me protection. And maybe closure. A few months later, under my structured plan, some debts were stabilized. The house was saved, barely. My mother had to downsize her lifestyle. My cousins had to work actual jobs instead of chasing big opportunities. They resented me for it. But they complied. Because deep down, they knew I wasn't wrong. One evening, my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I didn't think you would succeed," she admitted. That was the closest thing to honesty she had ever given me. "I know," I replied. There was a long pause. "I was afraid," she whispered. And not of me, but of losing control. I didn't respond immediately. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than victory. "I don't expect forgiveness," she added. And for the first time I realized I didn't need revenge anymore. Not by taking everything. not by destroying them, but by proving I never needed them to survive. The abandoned boy who slept on a bench at 16 now controlled the room without raising his voice. Money didn't make that happen. Pain did. And discipline. And the decision to build instead of break. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's this. Sometimes people leave you thinking you will fail. Sometimes family closes doors hoping you disappear. But if you survive, if you build quietly, if you grow stronger instead of bitter, one day, life will put you back in the same room. And this time, the strange thing about power is this: once you feel it, you realize it was never about control, it was about peace. For weeks after that meeting, everything went quiet. Too quiet. No angry calls, no emotional messages, no sudden family emergencies. Just silence. And I knew my family well enough to understand, silence didn't mean acceptance. It meant they were thinking. Planning, looking for a new angle. One evening, my lawyer called. "There's something you should know," he said. My chest tightened slightly. "Go on." "Your cousin tried to request a private financial audit through a third party. He was hoping to challenge the valuation of the estate." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. Of course. If they couldn't pressure me emotionally, they would try legally. "Will it affect anything?" I asked calmly. "No," my lawyer replied. "Everything is airtight. Your uncle prepared carefully." That sentence made me pause. Your uncle prepared carefully. He had seen this coming. He had known the family would resist. And he had trusted me to stand firm. But then my lawyer added something else. "There's also speculation they might try to paint you as emotionally unstable in order to push for guardianship of certain asset segments." I almost laughed. Emotionally unstable. The boy who survived alone at 16. The man who built businesses from scratch. But then I stopped laughing. Because I knew how narratives worked. They weren't trying to prove I was unstable. They were trying to create doubt. And doubt is powerful. So I made a decision right there. No reacting emotionally. No defending myself publicly. I would document everything. Keep everything professional. Let facts speak. Not at a restaurant this time. At the old family house. I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. Part of me didn't want to go back there. But another part of me needed to. Closure doesn't come from avoiding the past. It comes from facing it. When I stepped into that house again, I felt something unexpected. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt smaller. Smaller than my apartment. Smaller than my life. My mother was sitting at the dining table. No dramatic entrance. No cousins this time, just her. "I told them to stop," she said immediately. I didn't sit down yet. "Stop what?" "The games, the investigations, the rumors." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why?" She looked tired. "Because you're not bluffing. And they finally understand that." I sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about that night?" The question hung heavy between us. "Every year," I answered honestly. She nodded slowly. "I thought I was teaching you strength," she said quietly. "I thought being harsh would make you independent." I looked at her carefully. "You didn't teach me strength," I said. "You forced me to survive." Her eyes watered slightly, but she didn't cry. "You never asked why," she whispered. "Why?" I asked. She hesitated. "We're drawing in back then. Your uncle refused to help because he said we needed discipline." I panicked. I made decisions out of fear. I let that sink in, so it wasn't about me. It was about money. Again, sending me away reduced expenses. I asked calmly. She flinched. "Not like that. But it helped financially," I said. Silence answered for her. That was the truth. I wasn't a lesson. I was a liability. And that realization didn't make me angry anymore. It made me clear. "You were supposed to protect me," I said quietly. "I know." 3 words. Too late. But honest. The structure financial plan started working. Slowly. Carefully. Debts were reorganized. Risky ventures were shut down. Lifestyle spending was reduced. My cousins complained at first. But when reality hit, when they realized the alternative was bankruptcy, they stopped arguing. And something else changed too. They started asking for advice. Not demands. Advice. "How should we approach this deal? Is this investment safe? What would you do?" It was strange. The same people who once saw me as a burden now saw me as stability. But I never allowed ego to step in. I kept everything professional, measured, no emotional involvement. That was my boundary, a formal envelope. Inside was a simple note from my mother. Dinner no business, just family. I debated for a long time. Was this another strategy? Or was this something different? In the end, I went. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt normal. Food on the table. Soft conversation. No paperwork. No financial discussions. My mother looked at me differently that night. Not as a threat. Not as an opportunity. But as a person. Halfway through dinner, she said something that stunned the entire table. I was wrong. The room went silent. My cousins looked shocked. She continued, her voice steady. I underestimated you. I pushed you away when I should have supported you. And instead of apologizing, I tried to control you again. No one moved. No one spoke. Because everyone knew how rare those words were, she turned to me directly. I'm sorry. There it was. The thing I never thought I would hear. For years I imagined that moment. I imagined feeling victorious. Satisfied. But what I actually felt was calm. I don't hate you, I replied, and that was the truth. Hate requires energy. And I had already spent enough of my life surviving. I don't forget. I added gently. But I don't hate. Tears rolled down her face this time. Not dramatic, not manipulative, just quiet, and in that moment, something finally released inside me. Not forgiveness in a perfect, dramatic way. But acceptance. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. We didn't suddenly become close. There were still boundaries, still careful conversations. But the tension was gone. The power struggle ended. Because I no longer needed to prove anything. And they no longer underestimated me. A few years later, the estate had grown. Investments stabilized. Properties appreciated. The 70% my uncle left me multiplied, not because of luck, but because of discipline. One afternoon, I visited my uncle's grave. I stood there quietly, hands in my coat pockets. You were right, I said softly. I built. The wind moved gently through the trees. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the abandoned 16-year-old. I felt like a man who had survived something difficult and turned it into strength. If there's one lesson in all of this, it's simple. Being left behind can destroy you. Or it can define you. Revenge doesn't always look like shouting or taking everything. Sometimes revenge is quieter. Sometimes it's success. Sometimes it's peace. They demanded millions. They expected control. But what they received instead was boundaries. And the realization that the boy they once dismissed had become the strongest person in the room. And the most powerful part. I didn't have to break them to prove it. I just had to build myself. The inheritance was settled. The apologies were spoken. But real life doesn't end with a single emotional dinner. It continues. And sometimes it tests whether your strength is real or just temporary. About 2 years after the inheritance reading, the market shifted. Property values slowed, rental demand dipped, interest rates climbed. It wasn't a disaster, but it was pressure. And pressure reveals character. My phone started ringing again. Not with anger this time. With worry. Rashid's voice didn't carry pride anymore. It carried fear. We might not meet the next cycle payments, he admitted. The projections were wrong. I closed my eyes for a second. Years ago, they would have hidden this from me. Years ago, they would have blamed someone else. But this time, they came early. Before collapse. That alone told me growth had happened. Send me the full breakdown, I said calmly. No lectures, no I told you so. Just action. When I reviewed the numbers, I saw the problem clearly. They weren't reckless this time. They were inexperienced. They had followed advice from people who talked big but understood little. I arranged a meeting, not as a son, not as a nephew, but as the majority stakeholder. When I entered the room, I noticed something subtle. They stood up. Not out of fear. Out of respect. We spent hours reviewing data. Cutting unnecessary risks. Selling 2 underperforming assets before they could everything down. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches. Just discipline. And when the restructuring plan was finalized, my cousin looked at me and said something I never expected. I'm glad it was you. Glad what was me, I asked. Glad uncle chose you. We would have ruined this. That wasn't weakness, that was honesty. And in that moment, I understood something important. Revenge had already transformed into responsibility. One night, I couldn't sleep. Old thoughts returned. The bench at the train station, the cold nights, the feeling of being unwanted. No matter how successful you become, certain memories don't disappear. They just become quieter. I realized something else too. I had protected everyone financially, but I had never fully processed what happened emotionally. So I did something unexpected. I asked my mother to walk with me. No business talk. Just a walk through the old neighborhood. She agreed. We passed the school I used to attend. The small grocery store. The park bench, not the exact one, but close enough. I slept near here once, I said casually. She stopped walking. I didn't know where you went, she whispered. You didn't ask, I replied calmly. That wasn't said with anger, just fact. She swallowed hard. I was ashamed of me, of myself, she said. That answer shifted something slightly. Because shame and pride often look the same from the outside. Both create silence. Both create distance. I thought if I showed weakness, she continued, everything would collapse. And instead, I said quietly, you collapsed the one person who needed you. She nodded. No defense, no excuses, just truth. That conversation didn't magically heal the past, but it gave it shape. Understanding doesn't erase pain, but it removes confusion. My mother got sick. Not life-threatening at first, but serious enough to require surgery. Hospitals have a strange way of leveling everyone. Money doesn't matter in waiting rooms. Pride doesn't matter. Control doesn't matter. I sat there for hours while she was in surgery. My cousins paced nervously. And I realized something almost ironic. The same woman who once forced me to survive alone now depended on me for decisions. The doctors asked about insurance, about payments, about private care options. I handled everything. Not because I was obligated, not because I wanted praise, but because I chose to. There's a difference. When she woke up, weak and pale, she looked at me and whispered, you stayed. I squeezed her hand lightly. Less. She closed her eyes again, but tears slipped out. That was the moment I truly understood power. Power is not revenge. Power is choice. I had the power to walk away that day, but I didn't. Not because I forgot the past, but because I wasn't controlled by it anymore. We implemented stricter systems, clear audits, risk limits, savings buffers. No more gambling. No more big dreams without foundation. And slowly something else changed. Our conversation shifted from money to life, from survival to plans. Rashid started a smaller, realistic company and asked me to mentor him properly. One cousin went back to school. Another sold his flashy car and invested in a modest home instead. Small decisions, but meaningful ones. One evening, we gathered again at the same house where the inheritance reading once shook everything. I stood in the living room, looking around. 14 years ago, I left that house with a backpack and nothing else. Years later, I walked back in as the strongest person in the room. Not because of money, but because I had faced abandonment and didn't let it define my worth. My mother approached me quietly during the gathering. You changed the direction of this family, she said. No, I replied gently. Uncle did. She shook her head. He gave you assets. You gave them discipline. Maybe she was right. But I didn't say it. Because ego is the fastest way to lose everything you build. Maybe someone closed a door on you. Maybe they believed you wouldn't survive without them. Here's what I learned. When people abandon you, they expect two things. Either you'll fail, or you'll spend your life trying to prove yourself to them. But there's a third option: you can build quietly. Without announcements. Without revenge speeches. Without begging for validation. And one day, life might place you back front of the same people, not for revenge, not for applause, but for proof. Proof that their decision didn't destroy you. My mom left me at 16. Years later, at the inheritance reading, they demanded millions. They expected control. They expected guilt. They expected weakness. But what they got instead was a man who understood boundaries. A man who built instead of broke. A man who realized the greatest revenge isn't taking everything from those who hurt you. It's living so well that you no longer need anything from them at all. And that is real power. After that chapter of life, Things settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. The family learned boundaries, I learned patience, and my mother, slowly, learned humility. She never fully apologized beyond that first, "I'm sorry." But her actions started to match the words. No more attempts to manipulate. She asked for advice, not control. She accepted guidance, not orders. And for me, that was enough. Over time, I invested not just in property, but in people. Cousins who had once tried to pressure me now ran small businesses under my mentorship. My mother started volunteering at a local community center. Something she never had time for before, and while I didn't actively involve myself, I quietly monitored that she wasn't overextending. It was strange to see her try to care without trying to take control. Every holiday I'd go to the old family house. We'd eat together, we'd talk, but the conversations weren't forced. There was laughter, sometimes mild bickering, but never that old tension. The past was never erased. I carried it with me, but it no longer dictated our interactions. And me? I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had survived. Sleeping on benches, working double shifts, constantly questioning my worth, it had shaped me into someone resilient. Not bitter, not vengeful. Just unshakable. I could look at my mother now and see her as a person, flawed, yes, but human, and not a tyrant who had ruined my life. Occasionally, I'd think about my uncle. The man who had quietly supported me from the shadows, who had protected me with both wisdom and assets. I'd visit his grave and talk to him about my life, telling him what I had accomplished, how I had maintained discipline, and how I had even managed to guide my family without falling back into resentment. I could feel his pride if it was silent. Life moved on. Challenges came, business risks, market shifts, personal setbacks, but nothing shook the foundation I had built. I was no longer at the mercy of anyone else's decisions or neglect. My mother, my cousins, even strangers who had once thought I was weak, now respected that I stood firmly on my own. Sometimes, late at night, I'd reflect on that 16-year-old boy, abandoned and confused, wondering how he would feel if he could see me now. Strong, confident, capable, and at peace. He'd probably smile, maybe with a touch of disbelief. And I'd think the best revenge isn't confrontation. It isn't shouting, or taking everything from those who wronged you. The best revenge is growth, is success, is living your life fully, unapologetically, and proving, quietly but undeniably, that being abandoned doesn't mean being defeated. Because at the end of the day, power isn't taking money or control from others. Power is standing tall after the storm, protecting yourself, and choosing your own path. And that is the story I carry, the story of survival, wisdom, and the quiet, unshakable triumph over those who doubted me. The past didn't define me, it refined me. And that, more than anything else, was the inheritance my uncle had truly left me. Even now, years later, I catch myself thinking about how fragile life can feel when someone you depend on abandons you. That 16-year-old boy would never have imagined he could navigate adulthood alone, yet here I am, not just surviving, but thriving. I realized something important along the way: people leave, doors close, and circumstances can feel impossible. But those moments don't have to define the rest of your life. You can choose to build, step by step, brick by brick, even when no one is watching, and even when it seems hopeless. And eventually, those same people who doubted you might look back and see someone completely different. Someone stronger, wiser, and unshakable. My mother and cousins. They're still part of my life, but on my terms. There's still distance, yes, but it's respectful now. The anger that once burned so brightly inside me has cooled into clarity. I no longer measure myself by their approval, and I no longer need to prove anything to them. I have my own life, my own rules, and my own peace. I've come to understand that forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself. I don't forget the past, and I don't excuse it, but I refuse to let it control me anymore. My uncle's guidance, his careful planning, and his trust in me gave me the tools to not just survive, but to flourish. Now, when I think about that night 14 years ago, when the door closed behind me, I don't feel fear or anger. I feel gratitude for the lessons, for the resilience it forced me to develop, and for the clarity it gave me about who I am and what I can achieve. And as I look forward, I know life will continue to throw challenges my way. There will be moments of doubt, unexpected setbacks, and tests of patience. But I also know this: I am stronger than I ever thought possible. I am capable of handling what comes. And the abandoned 16-year-old, he would be proud of the man I've become. The inheritance was more than money. It was a chance to rewrite my story. To prove that survival isn't enough, that strength, wisdom, and integrity matter far more than anger or revenge. And in the end, that's the most powerful legacy anyone could ever leave behind. Because some doors close thinking you'll fail. But life has a way of opening others, showing that the person they underestimated can rise higher than they ever imagined. And that, in itself, is the ultimate triumph. Is Ka Ab final part due? Here's the final part in English, wrapping up the story with closure, reflection, and moral. Years have passed since all the legal battles, the inheritance reading, and the tense dinners. Life has settled into a rhythm I never could have imagined at 16. The boy who once slept on benches now has stability, independence, and a life built entirely on his own choices. My mother and cousins are no longer threats to my peace. They are family, yes, but now in a way that respects boundaries. We interact carefully, thoughtfully, without manipulation or expectation. And that, more than anything else, feels like victory, not over them, but over the circumstances that once left me powerless. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about what would have happened if I had stayed small, if I had allowed anger or revenge to define me. I realize now that my true strength didn't come from wealth, or from proving them wrong, or from the inheritance itself. It came from the decision to survive, to grow, and to build a life that was mine, fully mine, without needing anyone's approval. I also learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing what was done. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. I don't forget the pain. I don't erase the nights of fear or the years of abandonment. But I have released their hold over me. And in that release I discovered freedom. The inheritance, the money, the legal power, all of that mattered, yes. But the real inheritance my uncle left me was far greater wisdom, resilience, and the understanding that life doesn't reward bitterness or dependence. Life rewards patience, strength, and the courage to build something lasting from nothing. Sometimes life will place the people who hurt you back in front of you, expecting control, obedience, or guilt. And sometimes, all you have to do is stand tall, stay calm, and let the life you've built speak for itself. They will realize too late that the person they underestimated isn't the one who needs them anymore. As for me, I've chosen a life of quiet strength. I mentor others, I make smart decisions, I live fully, and I don't carry the chains of resentment. The boy who was left behind at 16 would never have imagined this life, but I know he would be proud. So if you've ever been abandoned, dismissed, or left to fend for yourself, remember this: the doors that close on you are not the end. They are the beginning. The choices you make, the strength you build, and the life you create in spite of them, that is your ultimate revenge. Not anger, not control, not money, but survival, growth, and peace. The end.